Welcome, time travelers. SolaTales here, and tonight's adventure takes us straight into medieval times, an era when life moved to the patient plodding of oxen, and nights came alive with the golden glow of tallow candles. So dim the lights, sit back, and relax. We are going back to the year 1347. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the valley of Millbrook, painting the thatched roofs with the softest gold. The world moved at the pace of seasons and heartbeats, where each day unfolded like the gentle opening of a flower. The village lay nestled in a fold of green hills, 23 houses in all, their walls of timber and clay rising from foundations of weathered stone. Smoke began to curl from a few chimneys, thin ribbons of gray that dissolved into the pale morning sky. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of dew-heavy grass and the distant fragrance of wild herbs growing along the forest edge. In the small chamber above Guillaume's bakery, young Aldrich stirred beneath his woolen blanket. The rough woven fabric, dyed a deep brown with oak bark, had warmed through the night from his body's heat. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds that marked each morning's beginning. First came the distant tolling of bells from the monastery of St. Bertha, their bronze voices calling across 3 miles of meadow and woodland. Then the roosters began their chorus, starting with old Hendrik's prize cock and spreading from house to house until the whole village rang with their proud announcements. The young man stretched slowly, feeling the straw mattress rustle beneath him. His sleeping alcove was small but comfortable, with walls of whitewashed timber and a single window that looked east toward the rising sun. Through the oiled parchment that covered the opening, he could see the sky growing lighter by degrees, from deep violet to pale rose to the softest yellow. Aldrich sat up and swung his legs over the edge of his simple wooden bed frame. The floor beneath his bare feet was smooth worn oak, polished by decades of daily use. He reached for his clothes, laid out the night before on a 3-legged stool. First came his linen undertunic, soft from many washings, then his woolen tunic of undyed gray, and finally his woolen hose, each leg tied carefully to his belt with leather points. The process of dressing was unhurried and methodical. Each garment had its place, its purpose, its familiar weight and texture. His leather shoes, made by the village cobbler 3 seasons past, were supple and comfortable, molding to his feet like a second skin. The laces, cut from the same leather, threaded through brass eyelets with a soft whispering sound. Below in the bakery, the ovens held their breath. Master Guillaume had banked the fires carefully the evening before, covering the glowing coals with ash to preserve their heat through the night. Now Aldrich descended the narrow wooden stairs, each step creaking in a rhythm he knew by heart. The bakery smelled of yesterday's bread, a warm and yeasty fragrance that had soaked into the wooden walls and clay floor over years of daily baking. The morning ritual began as it always did. Aldrich took up the long-handled wooden paddle and carefully stirred the sleeping coals. Sparks rose like tiny golden stars, dancing in the dim light before fading away. He added kindling piece by piece, watching as small flames licked at the dry wood. The fire grew slowly, steadily, fed with split oak and beech until it roared softly in the oven's throat. While the ovens warmed, Aldrich prepared his workspace. The wooden bread peels, smooth from generations of use, hung from iron hooks driven into the timber walls. He took them down one by one, checking each for splinters or cracks. The wicker baskets that would hold the rising dough sat in neat rows on wooden shelves. Each had been woven by old Martha, whose fingers moved with the wisdom of 70 years. The baskets were lined with linen cloth, bleached white as snow and soft as silk. The measuring began with the same careful precision that marked all of Aldrich's work. Flour came from 3 different grains: wheat for the finest bread, rye for the common loaves, and barley for the poorest families. Each grain had its own character, its own color and texture. The wheat flour was pale as cream, fine enough to slip between his fingers like powder. The rye flour was darker, with a hearty scent that spoke of long winters and careful storage. The barley flour was coarsest of all, but it would fill hungry bellies and provide strength for the day's labor. From a wooden chest bound with iron strips, Aldrich measured out the flour using bronze cups that rang like small bells when they touched the sides of the containers. The scales, balanced on a frame of seasoned oak, held steady as he weighed each portion. 5 pounds of wheat flour, 8 pounds of rye, 3 pounds of barley. The numbers had been the same for months now, as steady and reliable as the sunrise. Salt came next, precious white crystals that had traveled from distant shores. Aldrich measured it carefully, for salt was costly and not to be wasted. Water from the village well, drawn fresh that morning, filled a large clay pitcher. The water was sweet and clear, filtered through layers of earth and stone until it emerged cold and pure. The sourdough starter waited in its covered crock, a living thing that had been fed and tended for longer than Aldrich had been alive. Master Guillaume had received it from his own master, who had received it from his, and so the chain of bread stretched back through generations. The starter bubbled gently, releasing the sharp, pleasant scent of fermentation. It was ready for the day's work. Mixing the dough was a meditation, a dance of hands and ingredients that followed rhythms older than memory. Flour made a mountain in the center of the kneading trough, carved from a single piece of elm. Aldrich made a well in the center, like a crater in a snowy peak, and into this hollow went the water, the salt, and generous spoonfuls of the living starter. The mixing began slowly, flour drawn into the liquid, a little at a time. Aldrich's hands worked with practiced ease, feeling the dough come together grain by grain. At first, it was shaggy and rough, but gradually it smoothed as gluten formed invisible threads throughout the mass. The transformation was gradual but inevitable, rough becoming smooth, dry becoming moist, separate ingredients becoming one unified whole. Kneading followed mixing as naturally as breathing followed heartbeat. The dough went onto the floured wooden board with a soft thump, and Aldrich began the ancient rhythm. Push with the heel of his hand, fold the far edge over, turn a quarter turn, and push again. The motion was hypnotic, repetitive, soothing. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The dough grew smoother with each cycle, developing the elasticity that would trap the gases of fermentation and create bread's tender crumb. Outside the bakery windows, the village was waking. Aldrich could hear the soft lowing of cattle as young Peter led them from their byre to the common pasture. The beasts' hooves made a gentle drumming on the packed earth of the village street, and their bells chimed with each step. Peter's voice rose in a wordless song, a melody passed down from father to son for generations. The cattle knew the song and followed peacefully, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. The kneading continued for a time, measured not by sand in an hourglass, but by the feel of the dough beneath his hands. When it was ready, when it had achieved that perfect balance of smoothness and elasticity, Aldrich divided it into portions. Each loaf would weigh exactly 2 pounds when baked, providing a full day's bread for a working man. The dividing was done by eye and experience, each piece shaped into a round ball and placed in its own basket to rise. The baskets went onto the wooden shelves that lined one wall of the bakery, each in its appointed place. Over them, Aldrich laid damp linen cloths to keep the rising dough from forming a skin. The cloth had been woven by his own sister, now married and living in the next village, and it carried faint memories of her careful hands and gentle songs. Now came the waiting, the patient time when yeast worked its slow magic. The dough would double in size over the course of 2 hours, growing fat and billowy as thousands of tiny bubbles formed throughout the mass. This was time Aldrich could use for other tasks, for the bakery was never without work to be done. He took up the broom, its handle worn smooth by countless hands, its bundled twigs still fragrant with the herbs among which they had grown. Sweeping was another meditation, the soft whisper of twigs against clay, the gentle gathering of flour dust and crumbs into neat piles. The floor of the bakery was uneven, worn into gentle hollows where generations of bakers had stood, and Aldrich knew every dip and rise. The fire in the ovens needed tending, coals rearranged and fresh wood added. The flames danced and flickered, casting moving shadows on the walls. The heat grew steadily, warming the stone of the oven floor until it would be ready to receive the risen loaves. Aldrich tested the temperature with his hand, feeling for that moment when the heat was just right, neither too fierce nor too gentle. As the morning progressed, the sounds of village life grew richer. Children's voices rose from the street as they drove geese to the pond, their bare feet pattering on the stone. The geese complained with harsh honks, but they knew the routine and waddled along willingly enough. At the well in the village center, women gathered with their clay pitchers and wooden buckets, their voices blending in comfortable conversation as they drew water for the day's needs. The blacksmith's hammer began its rhythmic ringing, iron striking iron in patterns as old as civilization itself. Thomas was making nails today. Aldrich could tell by the quick, light taps. Horseshoe work made heavier, more deliberate sounds, while blade forging rang with a different music altogether. The forge fire glowed bright red, and sparks flew like tiny stars each time the hammer fell. From her doorway, old Agnes worked at her spinning wheel, the steady whir of the wheel mixing with the soft drawing out of wool into thread. Her fingers moved with the automatic grace of long practice, thinning and twisting the fibers into yarn that would become cloth, that would become clothing, that would keep bodies warm through the long winter months. The wool had come from the village sheep, raised on the common pasture, and sheared each spring in a celebration that marked the season's turning. The water wheel at the mill began its steady turning as the sun climbed higher and the morning mist lifted from the stream. The great wooden wheel, bound with iron and sealed with pitch, caught the flowing water in its buckets and turned with ponderous grace. Inside the mill, the heavy stones would begin their grinding, crushing grain into flour with the same motion that had fed villages for 1,000 years. Aldrich checked his rising dough, lifting the corners of the linen cloths to peer beneath. The loaves had grown nicely, swelling to nearly twice their original size. The surface was smooth and taut, with just the right spring when pressed gently with a fingertip. Soon they would be ready for the oven, but not quite yet. Timing was everything in bread making, and patience was the baker's greatest virtue. He decided to make his morning journey to the mill to collect the flour that Master Guillaume had ordered the day before. The walk through the village was a pleasure, a chance to see neighbors and observe the peaceful rhythm of daily life. The morning air was warming now, but still carried the freshness of dawn. Dew still sparkled on the grass verges, and early flowers nodded from dooryard gardens. The path to the mill was well worn, generations of feet having polished the stones and packed the earth between them. Ancient oak trees lined the way, their branches forming a green tunnel overhead. In their shade, wildflowers bloomed in profusion. Meadowsweet and campion, ladies' bedstraw and wild thyme. Bees hummed among the blossoms, their legs heavy with pollen, working with the same steady dedication that Ulrich brought to his bread. At the mill, Master Edmund was already at work, his flour-dusted apron white against his brown tunic. The great stones were turning, driven by the patient water wheel, and grain poured in a steady stream from the hopper above. The sound was deep and rhythmic, a grinding that seemed to come from the earth itself. Flour dust hung golden in the slanted sunbeams that streamed through the mill's windows. "Good morning, young Ulrich," Edmund called over the noise of the machinery. His voice was warm with the friendship of long acquaintance. "Your flour is ready, ground fine, just as Master Guillaume prefers." The miller led the way to where the sacks waited, each marked with Guillaume's sign burned into the cloth. The flour within was pale and fine, the product of careful grinding and patient sifting. Each grain had been crushed just enough to release its goodness, without destroying the delicate structures that would give bread its texture and flavor. Loading the sacks onto his wooden barrow was work that required care and balance. Each sack weighed near 40 pounds, and the barrow could carry 4 if properly arranged. The sacks settled with soft thumps, raising small clouds of flour dust that danced in the morning light. The barrow's single wheel, bound with iron, would roll smoothly over the path back to the bakery. The return journey was slower, the loaded barrow requiring attention and care. But this too was pleasant work, part of the rhythm that made each day complete. Other villagers were about their morning tasks, and each exchange of greetings added to the web of community that bound the village together. Old Henrik was repairing the wattle fence around his vegetable garden, weaving fresh hazel withes between the upright stakes. His hands, gnarled with age but still sure, worked with the skill of long practice. At the carpenter's shop, young Willem was shaping a wheel, spoke with his draw knife, long curls of wood falling at his feet like golden snow. The spoke would join 11 others to form a wheel, and the wheel would carry loads of grain or hay or passengers for years to come. Each cut of the knife was deliberate and sure, shaping the wood with the patience that good craftsmanship demanded. Back at the bakery, Aldrich unloaded the flour sacks with the same care he had used in loading them. Each went to its proper place in the storage room, where they would wait their turn to become bread. The air in the storage room was cool and dry, perfect for keeping grain fresh and free from the mice and weevils that plagued careless housekeepers. The risen dough was ready now, the loaves swollen and light beneath their linen covers. Aldrich removed the cloths carefully, revealing the smooth, pale surfaces marked here and there with the impressions of the linen's weave. Each loaf was perfect in its own way, ready for the transformation that fire would bring. Shaping the loaves for baking was an art learned through years of practice. Each ball of dough went onto the floured board, where gentle hands coaxed it into its final form. Round loaves were traditional, their shape pleasing to the eye and practical for even baking. The surface of each loaf was scored with a sharp knife, making cuts that would guide the bread's expansion in the oven's heat. The oven was ready now, its floor hot enough to bake, but not so fierce as to burn. Aldrich swept the hot stone clean with a long-handled brush, removing any ash or debris that might mar the bread's crust. The oven's mouth glowed like the entrance to a fiery cave, but the heat was welcoming rather than threatening, the promise of transformation rather than destruction. Loading the oven required speed and precision. Each loaf went onto a wooden peel, the long-handled paddle that would slide it into the oven's embrace. With a swift, practiced motion, Aldrich slid the first loaf onto the hot stone, then quickly withdrew the peel. The bread settled with a soft sigh, beginning immediately its transformation from pale dough to golden loaf. One by one, the loaves took their places on the oven floor, arranged with careful spacing to ensure even baking. When all were loaded, Aldrich sealed the oven mouth with its heavy wooden door, trapping the heat within. Now time and fire would work their ancient magic, creating from simple ingredients the staff of life itself. The baking would take near an hour, time enough for other tasks. The kneading trough needed cleaning, the peels required oiling, and there were always small repairs and maintenance tasks that kept the bakery running smoothly. But first, Aldrich allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, standing in the warm kitchen and breathing the familiar scents of yeast and flour, wood smoke, and baking bread. Outside, the morning was giving way to the heat of midday. The sun climbed toward its zenith, painting the village in bright gold and deep shadow. In dooryard gardens, vegetables grew in neat rows, onions and leeks, cabbages and turnips, beans climbing wooden poles with patient persistence. The gardens provided much of what the villagers ate, supplementing the grain that was their staple with fresh flavors and vital nourishment. Children played in the dusty street, their games as old as childhood itself. Hoops cut from barrels rolled down the gentle slope, chased by running feet and laughing voices. Spinning tops danced on the packed earth, their wooden bodies blurring with speed. A group of girls played at keeping house, using broken pottery as dishes and grass as food in their miniature world of imagination. The village dogs lay in whatever shade they could find, tongues lolling in the growing heat. They were working dogs, mostly, bred to guard and herd rather than merely to provide companionship. But they were well-fed and kindly treated, valued members of the community who earned their keep through loyal service. From the church tower, the single bronze bell began to ring, calling the village to midday prayers. Its voice was deeper and more resonant than the monastery bells, casting circles of sound that reached to every corner of the settlement. One by one, the sounds of daily work ceased, as people paused for a moment of reflection and gratitude. Aldrich paused in his cleaning to to listen to the bell's call. The sound always moved him, connecting this moment to all the moments that had come before, linking his small life to something larger and more enduring. When the ringing ceased, he returned to his work, but with a sense of peace that would carry him through the remainder of the day. The bread was beginning to smell ready, the sweet scent of baking dough filling the bakery and spilling out into the street. Neighbors passing by would nod approvingly, knowing that fresh bread would soon be available. In a world where yesterday's bread was already growing stale, the daily miracle of baking was never taken for granted. Aldrich tested the bread with his knuckles, tapping on the oven door to hear the hollow sound that meant the loaves were fully baked. The sound was perfect, deep and resonant, promising bread with a crisp crust and tender crumb. He opened the oven door, releasing a wave of heat and the intoxicating aroma of fresh bread. The loaves emerged golden brown, their crusts crackling as they cooled in the sudden change of temperature. Each was perfect in its own way, bearing the subtle marks that showed it had been made by human hands rather than cast in a mold. Aldrich arranged them on wooden racks to cool, knowing that Master Guillaume would be pleased with the morning's work. The midday meal was simple but satisfying. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, was torn into chunks and eaten with soft cheese made from the milk of the village goats. The cheese was white and creamy, with a mild tang that complemented the bread's nutty flavor. Small ale, brewed from barley and flavored with wild herbs, provided refreshment without the potency that would cloud the afternoon's work. Master Guillaume joined Aldrich for the meal, as was their custom. The older man's approval of the morning's baking was evident in his satisfied nod and the way he savored each bite. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that comes between people who have worked together long enough to understand each other without words. "The grain is good this year," Guillaume observed, breaking a piece of bread and examining its texture, fine and sweet, with no trace of mold or weevil. "Edmund has done well with his grinding." Aldrich nodded agreement, tasting the bread with the educated palate of one who knew the craft. Each grain of wheat had its own character, influenced by soil and weather, harvest time and storage conditions. A skilled baker could read these influences in the finished bread, understanding the year's story through taste and texture. After the meal came the traditional rest, a time when even the busiest villages fell quiet in the heat of midday. Aldrich and Guillaume withdrew to the small garden behind the bakery, where fruit trees provided shade and herbs grew in neat rows. The garden was Master Guillaume's pride, tended with the same care he brought to his bread. Apple trees, planted when Guillaume first took over the bakery, now provided generous shade with their spreading branches. The apples were still small and green, but by autumn they would be red and sweet, perfect for the harvest celebrations. Beneath the trees, herbs grew in profusion: rosemary and sage, thyme and marjoram, all the flavors that would enliven winter's stored provisions. A small bench, carved from oak and smoothed by years of use, invited rest and contemplation. Aldrich settled onto it with a sigh of satisfaction, feeling the pleasant tiredness that comes from useful work well done. The morning's baking was complete, the day's bread cooling on its racks, and the afternoon stretched ahead with its own gentle rhythms. Bees worked among the herbs, their humming a drowsy counterpoint to the distant sounds of village life. A cat, grey as smoke and just as silent, stalked something unseen among the vegetable rows. Overhead, swallows darted and dipped, catching insects on the wing with acrobatic precision. The rest was brief but restorative. In the medieval world, time was measured not by the mechanical ticking of clocks, but by the natural rhythms of sun and season, work and rest. The midday pause was as much a part of the day's structure as the morning's baking or the evening's final tasks. As the sun began its slow descent from its zenith, the village stirred back to life. The sounds of afternoon work began. The rhythmic thump of laundry being beaten clean at the washing stones, the scrape of hose in garden earth, the patient click of knitting needles in capable hands. Aldrich rose from the bench and stretched, feeling ready for the afternoon's tasks. There was always more to do in the bakery. Tomorrow's starter to feed, flour to sift, equipment to maintain. But first, he had promised to help Father Benedict at the village church, where repairs were needed to the wooden altar rail. The walk to the church took him through the heart of the village, past the well where afternoon water drawing had begun. Women balanced clay jugs on their hips with practiced ease, their movements graceful despite the weight they carried. Children played around the well's stone rim, their games now quieter in the growing heat. The church of St. Columba stood at the village's highest point, its stone tower visible from every house. Built 2 centuries before of local limestone, it had weathered to a warm grey that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. The wooden door, carved with intertwining vines and sacred symbols, stood open to catch whatever breeze might stir the heavy air. Inside, the church was cool and dim, a welcome refuge from the heat. Colored light streamed through the single stained glass window, casting jeweled patterns on the stone floor. The window showed St. Columba himself, his robes blue as heaven, his hands raised in eternal blessing. It had been paid for by the village over the course of 5 years, each family contributing what they could to bring color and beauty into their place of worship. Father Benedict was kneeling before the altar, his grey head bowed in prayer. He was a kindly man, educated at the monastery school, but never losing the common touch that made him beloved by his flock. When he heard Aldrich's footsteps on the stone, he rose and turned with a welcoming smile. "Ah, my young friend," he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "Come to help with our carpentry, have you? The altar rail has developed a wobble that disrupts the solemnity of the service." Together they examined the problem. The rail, carved from oak and polished by countless hands, had loosened at one of its joints. The repair would require careful work with chisel and mallet, but nothing that couldn't be accomplished with patience and skill. Aldrich had learned carpentry from his father before taking up the baker's trade, and his hands still remembered the feel of sharp tools and seasoned wood. The work was pleasant and unhurried. Father Benedict held the rail steady while Aldrich carefully cleaned out the loose joint and applied fresh wooden dowels secured with hide glue. They talked quietly as they worked, sharing observations about the weather, the crops, and the small events that made up village life. "Young Margaret is showing signs of her time approaching," the priest observed, speaking of the baker's daughter in the next village. Her husband sent word asking for prayers for a safe delivery. "She'll do well," Aldrich replied, testing the joint's tightness. she's strong, and her mother will be with her. Birth and death were part of life's fabric in these times, accepted with the faith that came from living close to nature's cycles. The repair completed, they stood back to admire their work. The altar rail was solid once again, ready to provide support for countless more prayers and celebrations. The satisfaction that comes from making something whole and useful again filled the small church with a sense of completion. "Will you stay for afternoon prayers?" Father Benedict asked, but without pressure. He understood that each person's relationship with the divine was their own, not to be forced or rushed. "For a little while," Aldrich replied. He found peace in the church's quiet atmosphere, a counterpoint to the busy activity of the bakery. He knelt on the worn stone before the altar and let his mind grow still, feeling gratitude for the day's work and the community that sustained him. The prayers were simple and familiar, words worn smooth by generations of repetition. They spoke of thanksgiving for daily bread, for health and strength, for the changing seasons and the eternal truths that gave meaning to temporary lives. When they ended, Aldrich felt refreshed in spirit as well as body. Leaving the church, he walked slowly back through the village, observing the afternoon's quiet activities. At the blacksmith's forge, Thomas was banking his fire for the evening, the coals glowing like dragon's eyes in the shadowed workshop. The day's work was nearly done, horseshoes and tools cooling on the anvil, waiting for tomorrow's collection by their owners. In her doorway, Agnes still worked at her spinning, the wheel turning with hypnotic regularity. The pile of prepared wool beside her had diminished noticeably since morning, transformed into neat skeins of yarn that would eventually become warm clothing for the winter months ahead. Her fingers moved without conscious thought, guided by decades of practice. The cooper's shop was quiet now, Robert having completed the day's work on the barrels that would store the coming harvest's grain and ale. Wood shavings curled on his workbench like golden spirals, and the sweet scent of oak lingered in the air. Each barrel was a work of art as well as utility, its staves fitted with precision that would keep contents safe and dry for years to come. At the mill, the great wheel still turned, but slower now as the afternoon heat reduced the stream's flow. Edmund would soon shut down the machinery for the day, but not before grinding enough flour for tomorrow's needs. The steady rhythm of the stones had become part of the valley's heartbeat, as essential and reliable as sunrise and sunset. Children were being called in for their evening meal, their mothers' voices carrying across the village with loving authority. The games of the afternoon were abandoned as young ones hurried toward the promise of fresh bread and warm soup. Even the village dogs seemed to understand that the day's freedom was ending, and they trotted homeward with tails wagging. Back at the bakery, Aldrich found Master Guillaume preparing for the evening's final tasks. Tomorrow's bread would need to be started tonight, the sourdough starter fed, and the first mixing begun. The cycle was endless and comforting, each day's work preparing for the next in an unbroken chain of service to the community. They worked together in comfortable companionship, measuring flour and water, testing the starter's vigor, adjusting the mixture to account for the day's humidity and temperature. The science of bread making was still largely mystery in those days, but generations of experience had taught bakers to read the subtle signs that determined success or failure. The evening starter was more liquid than the morning dew, designed to ferment slowly through the cool night hours. It bubbled gently in its crock, alive with the microscopic creatures that would transform simple flour into the complex flavors of good bread. Aldrich covered it with a damp cloth and set it in its accustomed place, where the heat from the banked ovens would keep it at just the right temperature. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, the village prepared for evening. Smoke rose from chimneys as fires were built up for cooking the day's main meal. The scent of burning wood mixed with the aromas of stewing meat and vegetables, creating the distinctive perfume of a medieval evening. At the well, the final water drawing of the day brought together neighbors who might not have seen each other since morning. Conversations flowed as easily as the water, carrying news and gossip, plans and observations in the gentle current of community life. Children played around their mothers' feet, their energy finally beginning to flag after the long day's adventures. The monastery bells rang again, calling the faithful to evening prayers. Their bronze voices carried clearly across the valley, a reminder of the larger rhythms that governed medieval life. Some villagers would attend the service, while others would observe the moment of prayer in their own homes, but all would pause to acknowledge the day's ending. In the bakery's main room, neighbors began to gather for the evening's socializing. This was a tradition as old as the village itself, a time when the day's work was done and people could relax in each other's company. The warmth from the ovens made the bakery a comfortable gathering place, especially as the nights grew cooler with approaching autumn. Old Henrik arrived first, as was his custom, settling into his favorite spot on the wooden bench that ran along one wall. His weathered hands wrapped around a cup of ale, and his eyes held the satisfaction of another day's honest work completed. He had spent the afternoon mending his cottage's thatch, replacing worn straw with fresh bundles that would keep his family dry through the winter rains. Martha came next, her spinning abandoned for the day, her back straight despite her 70 years. She had raised 8 children in the village and seen most of them safely established in their own homes. Now she was grandmother to a dozen grandchildren, each one precious beyond measure. Her presence at the evening gatherings was treasured, for she carried the memory of the village's history in her stories and songs. Young Willem joined the group, his hands still smelling of the pine shavings from his carpentry work. He was newly married, full of plans and hopes for the future. His wife Anna was expecting their first child, and his joy at the prospect of fatherhood was evident in every gesture and word. The conversation flowed gently around topics of common interest. The weather, always crucial to farming communities, was discussed and analyzed. The recent rains had been sufficient but not excessive, perfect for the growing grain. The hay harvest would be good this year, ensuring plenty of fodder for the animals through the winter months. Father Benedict arrived as darkness began to fall, his evening rounds completed. He had visited the sick and elderly, carrying comfort and news to those who could not easily leave their homes. His presence added a note of gentle authority to the gathering, but he participated as a friend and neighbor rather than as a formal religious figure. Someone produced a wooden flute, its simple melody adding music to the evening's companionship. The tune was old and familiar, one that had been passed down through generations of village musicians. Others hummed along, their voices blending in harmonies learned by ear rather than from written notes. Children began to appear, drawn by the music and the warmth of adult conversation. They settled on the floor around their parents' feet, listening to stories that were part history, part legend, and entirely beloved. Tales of ancient heroes and wise kings, of saints and miracles, of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things in times of trial. The stories were never exactly the same twice, each teller adding their own touches and interpretations. But the essential truths remained constant. Courage was rewarded, kindness was returned, and good ultimately triumphed over evil. In a world where written books were rare and precious, these oral traditions carried the wisdom of the ages from one generation to the next. As the evening deepened, some of the gathering began to drift away to their homes. Children were carried off to bed by patient parents, their heads heavy with sleep and dreams. The older villagers remained longer, reluctant to end the day's final social pleasure. Ulrich listened to the gentle conversation with half his attention, the rest of his mind already turning toward tomorrow's work. The bread must be started before dawn, the ovens heated, the endless cycle of baking begun anew. But these thoughts brought no anxiety, only the satisfaction of knowing his place in the larger pattern of village life. The fire in the ovens was banked for the night, covered with ash to preserve enough heat for the morning's lighting. The tools were cleaned and put away, the flour sifted and ready for tomorrow's use. Each evening task was performed with care, ensuring that the next day's work would begin smoothly and efficiently. One by one, the last visitors said their farewells and departed for their homes. Candles and oil lamps flickered to life in windows throughout the village, warm points of light in the gathering darkness. Dogs settled down for the night's watch, and cats began their nocturnal prowling in search of unwary mice. Master Guillaume retired to his bed, leaving Aldrich to complete the final tasks. The young man moved through the familiar routines with quiet satisfaction, checking that all was secure for the night. The sourdough starter bubbled gently in its crock, ready to begin tomorrow's transformation of grain into bread. In the small chamber above the bakery, Aldrich prepared for sleep. He removed his day clothes carefully, hanging each garment in its proper place. His woolen nightshirt, soft from many washings, provided warmth against the cooling air. The window stood open to the night breeze, bringing the sense of grass and growing things, wood smoke, and the distant forest. Outside, the village settled into its nighttime quiet. An owl called from the ancient oak near the well, its voice haunting and beautiful in the stillness. Somewhere a dog barked once, and then fell silent. The night watch would soon begin their rounds, ensuring that all was peaceful and secure. From his window, Aldrich could see the soft glow of candlelight in a few cottage windows, where families concluded their evening prayers or finished the last tasks of the day. The baker's wife in the house across the narrow street was banking her cooking fire, the orange glow fading to dim embers that would keep her hearth alive until morning. Her movements were graceful and efficient, following patterns learned from her mother and grandmother before her. The monastery bells rang one final time, their bronze voices carrying the call to Compline across the sleeping valley. The sound was softer now, gentler than the bold proclamations of dawn and midday. It spoke of rest earned and peace deserved, of another day completed in the endless cycle of seasons and years. Aldrich knelt beside his simple wooden bed for his evening prayers. The words came easily, worn smooth by nightly repetition, yet still meaningful in their familiar cadence. He gave thanks for the day's work, for health and strength, for the community that sustained him, and the craft that gave purpose to his days. He prayed for Master Guillaume's continued health, for the villagers who depended on their daily bread, and for the simple blessing of another day lived in service to others. The straw mattress welcomed his tired body with its rustling embrace. The woolen blanket, heavy and warm, settled over him like a protective cloud. His head found the familiar hollow in the feather pillow that his sister had sewn for him 3 summers past, filled with down from the village geese and scented faintly with lavender from the monastery garden. Sleep did not come immediately. In the quiet of the night, Aldrich's mind wandered over the day's small events and satisfactions. The perfect rise of the morning's bread, the companionable work with Father Benedict, the gentle conversation of the evening's gathering. Each memory brought its own quiet pleasure, threads in the tapestry of a life lived simply but well. The village around him was settling deeper into sleep. The last candles were being extinguished, their brief flames surrendering to the patient darkness. Children's voices, which had provided a cheerful soundtrack to the day, were now stilled in slumber. Even the ever-present sounds of animals grew quieter as horses shifted in their stalls and cattle settled in their byres. A gentle breeze stirred the curtain at his window, bringing with it the night scents of the countryside. Wild roses bloomed along the forest edge, their perfume mixing with the green smell of grass and leaves. Somewhere in the darkness, night-blooming flowers opened their petals to the moon, jasmine and honeysuckle adding their sweetness to the air. The sound of water reached his ears, the gentle murmur of the stream that powered the village mill. By day, the water worked tirelessly, turning the great wheel that crowned their grain. By night, it sang a softer song, a lullaby that had soothed countless generations to sleep. The stream had flowed here since before the first house was built, and would continue flowing long after the last stone had crumbled to dust. In the forest beyond the village fields, nocturnal creatures were beginning their quiet activities. An owl hooted again, closer now, perhaps perched on the great elm that shaded the church. Mice rustled through the grain stores, their tiny feet making the faintest whisper of sound. Cats stalked through the darkness on silent paws, their eyes gleaming like amber stars. The night sky, unmarked by the smoke and light that would burden future centuries, blazed with stars. From his window, Aldrich could see the familiar constellations that had guided travelers and marked seasons since time immemorial. The plow, the hunter, the swan, their ancient patterns told stories as old as human memory, connecting this small village to the vast cosmos that wheeled overhead. A shooting star traced a brief arc across the darkness, its light flaring and fading in the space of a heartbeat. Such celestial visitors were considered omens in these times, messages from the divine realm. This one seemed benevolent, a blessing on the sleeping village and promise of fair weather for tomorrow's work. The bells of the monastery fell silent, their bronze voices stilled until dawn would call them to life again. In the scriptorium, a single monk might still be working by candlelight, copying sacred texts with patient precision. His pen would scratch softly across the parchment, forming letters that would carry wisdom across the centuries. But most of the religious community was deep in sleep, their daily round of prayer and labor completed. Aldrich's breathing began to slow and deepen as sleep finally approached. His body, tired from the day's honest work, began to relax into the mattress. The familiar scents of the bakery rose from below: yeast and flour, wood smoke, and warm stone. These aromas were the backdrop of his life, as constant and comforting as heartbeat or breath. In the darkness, time seemed to stretch and slow. Minutes passed like hours, each moment full and complete in itself. This was the gift of the medieval night, when artificial lights did not chase away the darkness, and mechanical clocks did not chop time into rigid segments. Night was for rest and contemplation, for the slow healing of body and spirit that only true quiet could bring. The sourdough starter below continued its patient work, bubbles rising and breaking on its surface with tiny pops too soft to hear. Yeast cells divided and multiplied, creating the living community that would transform tomorrow's flour into bread. This ancient partnership between human and microbe had sustained civilization since the first wild yeasts were captured and tamed by unknown bakers in the dawn of history. A night bird called from somewhere in the village, its voice joining the gentle symphony of small sounds that filled the darkness. Leaves rustled in the light breeze, timber creaked as it cooled from the day's heat, and thatch whispered as night creatures moved through its sheltering embrace. These sounds were the village's nighttime voice, as different from its daytime bustle as whispers were from shouts. Sleep began to claim Aldrich at last, creeping over him like a gentle tide. His thoughts grew softer and less coherent, blending into the formless realm where dreams were born. The day's memories dissolved into a warm glow of satisfaction, work completed and duty fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and pleasures, but for now, there was only the blessed release of sleep. His breathing settled into the deep, regular rhythm of slumber. The slight tension that even the most pleasant work brings to muscles and mind began to ebb away, leaving behind the perfect relaxation that only complete rest could provide. In sleep, his body would repair the small damages of the day, restore energy spent in honest labor, and prepare for the cycle to begin anew with dawn's first light. The village around him sank deeper into its nocturnal peace. Windows that had glowed with candlelight grew dark, one by one, as families settled into their beds. Children dreamed of games and adventures, while their parents found rest in the satisfaction of another day's work completed. The elderly slept the light sleep of age, their dreams full of memories stretching back across decades of village life. Even the animals joined in the night's quiet rest. Horses stood sleeping in their stalls, their weight shifting from foot to foot in the ancient rhythm of equine slumber. Cattle lay in the sweet hay of their byres, chewing cud with slow contentment. Pigs rooted gently in their sties, seeking the perfect spot for sleep. Chickens roosted on their wooden perches, heads tucked beneath wings, waiting for dawn's call to begin another day of scratching and pecking. The monastery's night office would soon begin, but softly, with voices pitched low so as not to disturb the sleeping valley. The monks' prayers would rise like incense in the darkness, carrying the hopes and needs of the entire community to heaven. These holy men, dedicated to prayer and contemplation, served as the village's spiritual guardians, watching through the night hours when others slept. In his dreams, Aldrich walked through fields of golden wheat that swayed in an eternal breeze. The grain was perfect, heavy with kernels that would make the finest bread. His dream hands gathered the wheat with joy, knowing that it would feed his village for years to come. The sun in his dream sky never moved from its perfect position, casting warm light that made everything glow with inner radiance. The night deepened around the sleeping village. Clouds drifted across the star-filled sky, their shadows passing over rooftops and gardens like gentle benedictions. The moon, nearly full, cast silver light that transformed the familiar streets into something magical and mysterious. Every stone and timber seemed touched with otherworldly beauty, as if the village existed in two worlds simultaneously: the practical realm of daily life and the enchanted sphere of dreams and possibilities. Time flowed differently in the depths of night. Hours could pass in what felt like minutes, or minutes could stretch into seeming eternities. This was the temporal realm of sleep and dreams, where the rigid schedules of daylight gave way to the fluid rhythms of rest and restoration. Bodies healed, minds processed the day's experiences, and spirits found the peace that only darkness could provide. The baker's art would begin again with dawn, but for now the ovens rested cool and silent. The flour lay in its sacks, the tools hung in their accustomed places, and the sourdough starter worked its slow magic without human guidance. All was prepared for tomorrow's work, but tonight belonged to rest and dreams. A gentle rain began to fall, the first drops so soft they seemed more like mist than water. The sound was barely audible, a whisper against thatch and leaves that added another layer to the night's quiet symphony. The rain would refresh the gardens and fill the wells, a blessing on the sleeping village that would be revealed with morning's light. In his dream, Aldrich was no longer just a baker, but somehow connected to every grain of wheat that had ever grown, every loaf that had ever fed a hungry family. He felt the vast network of cultivation and craft that stretched across the world and through the centuries, linking his simple work to the great story of human civilization. The knowledge filled him with wonder and humility, understanding his place in the endless chain of those who fed their fellow beings. The village slept on, cradled in the darkness like a child in its mother's arms. Each house held its treasure of sleeping souls, each family secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring its own mixture of work and rest, challenge and satisfaction. This was the rhythm that had sustained human communities since the beginning of time, the patient alternation of activity and repose that allowed life to flourish. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, marking the passage of hours with movements too slow for human perception, but constant as the heartbeat of the universe itself. The same stars had watched over countless other villages, countless other bakers kneading their dough and banking their fires. In their eternal light, all human struggles and triumphs were held with equal tenderness and understanding. The night was deep now, the darkest hours before dawn, when sleep was most profound and dreams most vivid. This was when the boundary between waking and sleeping grew thinnest, when the soul could roam freely through realms normally hidden from conscious sight. In these sacred hours, healing took place on levels deeper than the merely physical, and wisdom flowed like a hidden river through the landscape of dreams. Aldrich slept the sleep of the righteous, deep and untroubled by anxiety or regret. His work was honest, his life simple, and his place in the community secure. What more could any soul ask for than the opportunity to serve others through the gifts they had been given? In sleep, this knowledge filled him with a peace that would carry over into waking, coloring all of tomorrow's tasks with quiet joy. The village around him was a picture of perfect tranquility, each cottage settled into the landscape as if it had grown there like a tree or stone. Generations of lives had been lived within these walls, children born and raised, couples wed and grown old together, seasons celebrated and sorrows shared. The very timbers held memories. The stones had witnessed countless human dramas play out in their sheltering embrace. And still the gentle rain fell, blessing the sleeping earth with its gift of moisture. Gardens would flourish, wells would remain full, and the harvest would be abundant. The rain was nature's benediction on human effort, the sky's recognition of the partnership between earth and sky, plant and person, work and rest that made life possible and beautiful. In the depths of sleep, all the village's souls were united in the common experience of rest and restoration. Rich and poor, young and old, all were equal in the democracy of sleep. Dreams came to all alike, carrying messages of hope and healing that would strengthen them for the challenges and joys of another day. And when morning came, as it always did, they would wake refreshed and ready to take up their tasks once more, part of the endless rhythm of life that had sustained their ancestors and would sustain their children yet to come. The night embraced them all with its gentle arms, keeping them safe until dawn's first light would call them back to the world of waking. In this perfect darkness, filled with the soft sounds of sleeping breath and dreaming souls, the village of Millbrook rested in absolute peace, a small haven of human warmth in the vast star-filled night. And in his sleeping chamber above the bakery, young Aldrich dreamed of bread rising, of ovens glowing warm and welcoming, of the simple satisfaction that comes from work well done in service of one's neighbors. His dreams were full of grain and flour, of the ancient rhythms that connected him to every baker who had ever lived, and of the quiet joy that filled each day with purpose and meaning. The night would pass, as nights always did, giving way eventually to dawn's gentle return. But for now, there was only this perfect moment of rest, this blessed interval of peace that restored the soul and prepared the heart for whatever joys and challenges tomorrow might bring. In the silence and the darkness, surrounded by the sleeping village that was his world, Aldrich slept the sleep of those who know their place in the great pattern of existence, whose lives, however simple, were part of something larger and more beautiful than they could fully comprehend. And in his dreams, the bread was always perfect, the ovens always warm, and the world always filled with a gentle kindness that made each day a gift to be treasured and shared.